Well, many people see faith and science as two distinct subjects that can never work hand in hand because they're so different in nature. But is that actually the case? Today's guest sees things a bit differently. Joining us from sunny Southern California is Dr. Jeff Zweerink. He is an astrophysicist and a senior research scholar with Reason to Believe, an organization that combines science and faith. And he's also the author of several books, including Escaping the Beginning, Confronting Challenges to the Universe's Origin. Welcome back to BCN, Dr. Zweerink. Great to have you on again.
Hi, Janet. Really looking forward to our time today, and thanks for the invitation to be here.
Of course. Okay, so first of all, maybe tell us a little bit about Reason to Believe.
Well, Reasons to Believe is all about really our fundamental purpose is to reveal God in science. And that it kind of has two different functions, two different aspects. One is that many people think, both scientists and Christian alike, think that science and Christianity are at odds or at tension with one another. And that really just isn't the case. And two, as we study God's revelation and creation, we find a lot about him. So we're just looking to show what has scientific advance shown us about who God is, this incredible, awesome God that we get to worship.
Okay, so you recently wrote a blog about the perceived conflict between science and faith, but you don't think there is a conflict, do you? So the argument tends to go something like this: because science deals with reasons and facts, it can't be part of religion because it operates on feelings and beliefs. So how would you respond to that?
There's a lot of angles to that, but I think probably one of the most critical things to recognize in that discussion is that the way we've defined faith, or the way faith is used in that term, is that it's kind of a belief, a feeling, something you want to be true, whether it is. And historically, Christians have not thought about faith that way. Yes, we use the term faith. Faith is incredibly important. But faith, as a Christian, Christians have historically thought about that, is confident trust in a reliable source. So faith is not, well, let's just figure out something and try and believe that. Faith is, how do things actually work? What's really true? And can we believe that? And if you take that definition of faith, then faith is asking, or the predicate of that is figuring out what are those reliable sources. Well, I think Scripture is an incredibly reliable source for telling who God is, who we are, and how we relate to one another. And I think science is an incredibly reliable source for figuring out how God has revealed himself in creation. So if we allow faith to be defined as kind of that feeling, I want to believe whatever I want, then yeah, they are in conflict. But if faith, as Christians have historically talked about it, as confident, trust, and a reliable source, science and Christianity are doing the same thing there. So they can't be in conflict.
Interesting. Okay. I guess another objection is that while Christians and other people of faith can be scientists, they must first check their religion at the lab door if they want to make any real progress. So, how would you answer this objection?
Well, just historically speaking, that is not an accurate assessment. And there's numbers of lines of evidence you could marshal to show that that's not the case. Among other things, go back and look at kind of the who's who of early scientists. You got Galileo, you got Isaac Newton, you've got Boyle, and all these people. These people were all devout Christians. In fact, the reason they were doing this study is that they wanted to understand how God had created the world. And so, unless you're going to argue that, well, Christians kind of got it started, but now that science is working, it's no longer something that supports the Christian faith, then you really have a non-starter of an argument there. So, just historically speaking, that has not been the case. But even today, you look at there are surveys that have looked at people and their beliefs, scientists and their beliefs over the 100 years ago and today, and there are these surveys of kind of surveying belief: is there a supernatural, is there not, those sorts of things. And even over the last 100 years, where you could argue, okay, this is the latest scientific, the cutting edge of where we are. in all of that time, the fraction of people who believe in a supernatural, who believe in Christianity, has largely remained unchanged in the biological sciences, the chemistry, physics, mathematics. They're all kind of largely the same. So that's just another place where the data doesn't support the idea that to be a Christian, you have to check your beliefs. And then the last thing I would comment is when I go in to do, I don't know that I go in to do science work. I just think like a scientist kind of all the time. But when I'm at my job doing the science, if you will, I'm going in and thinking, okay, when I go into the lab today, things are going to behave the same yesterday as they did today. And what I find today is going to align with, and there ought to be an explanation that's consistent across there. And this explanation ought to account for this other data. These are actually beliefs that I've derived from who I think God is. And so when I go into the lab, it's an extension of my Christian faith, not a something I have to do in contradiction to my Christian faith. So there's just a whole lot. I know there's that popular idea, but again, when you just go in and investigate it, it really doesn't pan out. The evidence doesn't support that idea.
Okay, well, I'm no scientist, but if I understand science correctly, a scientific study should include every single possibility as a potential answer. So, I guess in other words, you can't exclude a possible answer because you don't like it. So, are most of today's scientists guilty of that by excluding the possibility of a divine creator who exists outside of space and time?
That's kind of a complicated question to answer, but it because there's a mix of two things at least that I see going on there. One is that very clearly there are scientists who are antagonistic to the Christian faith, and they will, some of them are very vocal. Some of them are, they will marshal arguments to make that's the case, that, oh, God just shouldn't belong here. We're about doing that. There's also another component, though, is that by and large, what we're doing when we're doing science is we're saying, okay, these are the phenomena that we see. What are the quote unquote natural explanations for that? So as a physicist, when I'm looking for a good explanation, it ought to be based in what I know to be true from physics, that there's gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force, there are these conservation laws. So when I'm looking for an explanation, I'm looking for an explanation that fits within that realm. Now, I was just reading this morning. I happened to be reading in John, I think it's John 6, where Jesus was walking across the water. His disciples had gotten into the boat, sailed across the water for a little while. Storm came up. He was walking across the water. Scientifically, how would I go about studying that? Well, I could see it with my own eyes. But then if I went back and said, all right, what about the water allows this to happen? Or was there something on Jesus? You're going to find out that that's really hard to study scientifically because it's not reproducible. It's not something I can replicate in the lab. It's miraculous. So if God was coming in and just miraculously doing things all the time, how would we ever get a good understanding of things? Again, I'll go back to what as I've read scripture, what I see about God is that he is a reliable, trustworthy, consistent, orderly God. Well, if he's created the world that way, I would expect the world to behave in ways that I could quantify by quote unquote natural laws. So most scientists, when they're going in, what they're saying is, okay, there's this arena we're going to play in where we're going to say, let's look for natural explanations for natural phenomena that we can test and determine what there is there. I think that's a great way to approach things. The problem, or where that runs into an issue, is when you say this is the only way to know things. If you say, all right, science is the only way to know things, it's a great way to know certain things, but it's not the only way we can know what's there. And so for an example, I would say, well, if you wanted to study Jeff Zweerink scientifically, you could learn about how tall I am, how many fingers I have, how long I've been alive, how my body works, how I think about certain things. You could do all that, but you still wouldn't have a relationship with me. And ultimately, Christianity is about who is God, who are we, and how do we relate to him? And so I think science is a great tool for understanding God's revelation and what it tells us about him. But science may not be the best tool to actually engage in that relationship with him. That's not the only way we get to know things.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of scientists who see that, and then there are some who say, I just don't want to look at things that way.
Yeah. Does the Bible contain any information that has given Christian scientists direction to discover some scientific truths?
Absolutely. Again, I think when you look through the history, a lot of those early scientists were operating under the assumption that the world was orderly and regular, and we ought to be able to discern these patterns, and there's a structure and a purpose to things. But I can think of one specific example where that has played out. And if you go back to the early 1900s, in fact, you go earlier than that, and scientists thought space and time were just these absolute quantities that matter moved around in. Well, you come early 1900s, and Einstein developed his theories of relativity. Now we think, okay, he's just this scientist sitting, his patent clerk, and he develops these ideas. But the idea he actually had that led to general relativity was the idea that the laws of physics ought to be the same everywhere in the universe, no matter how you're moving. And that's a philosophical, and I would even argue a Christian religious idea. Because if Greek mythology is correct, we wouldn't expect the laws of physics to look the same everywhere. If Hinduism is correct, we wouldn't expect the laws of physics to look the same everywhere. But if God is the creator of all things, we would expect the laws of physics to look the same everywhere. So that's where he developed his theories of relativity, or the seed that led to the development of them. But as Georges Lemaitre was looking at Einstein's equations of general relativity, he actually came up with this biblical notion that there's a beginning, that there's a created order, that there's a purpose. And he actually developed the Big Bang models, which most scientists think are the correct description of the universe. Now, this is a Belgian priest coming at it with his ideas about who God is, looking at general relativity and saying, oh, these are the explanations that would fit with Christianity. And lo and behold, those are the ones that end up working. So yeah, very much. I don't think there are places where somebody looks at a verse and says, oh, I'm going to go out and find that scientifically. But when we look at what Scripture has to say, that does inform as scientists how we look at things and what we're going to be looking for. We expect to find a beginning. We expect to find order. We expect to find purpose. We expect to find consistency. Lo and behold, that's what we find when we look at the creation.
Yeah. You mentioned beginning there. So do scientists believe or agree that the universe had a beginning, or do they believe it existed forever?
Yes. Some do, some don't. What's interesting, and go back to the start of the 1900s, Einstein introduces his general relativity. Lemaitre puts forth Big Bang models. His work with Slipher eventually, and Hubble come up with this idea that the universe is expanding. Well, the moment you have an expanding universe governed by constant laws, that points to a beginning. And so I think you can make a strong argument the history of the 20th century and into the 21st century has been an exercise in scientists looking and saying, this is what we know. How do we develop models that don't have a beginning? Maybe the universe is oscillating. It grows and it collapses and then it regrows again. Or maybe it's always growing, but new matter is being created. Or maybe it's growing and there's a multiverse. All of these have been ideas that scientists have put forth that says, here's a way of looking at the universe that doesn't have a beginning. And what's interesting, to the extent we can measure it, and there's still things to measure in there, but to the extent we can measure and understand, the universe seems to keep pushing us back to solutions or models where the universe has a beginning. And so I think it's not that it's like if you're a scientist, you have to believe there's a beginning, but there's a whole lot of evidence pointing to our universe having a beginning.
I guess one of the biggest criticisms also of the Bible is that it says that the earth was created in 6 days. So most scientists believe the universe is about 14 billion years old. And this has also caused conflict, I guess, within the overall church, with many believing in that literal 6-day creation, while others like yourself believe that it's scriptural to believe in an old earth creation. So what do you mean by that?
So this was actually one of the first real places where I'm wrestling with, okay, what does scripture say and what does creation say? What does science say? And this is the first place where I'm like, okay, they don't quite line up. How do I deal with it? And so this is kind of when I was in college, I started wrestling with this idea. And in large part because I come with an approach that what scripture has to say is the final authority on what it has to say. It is holds scripture in high regard. It carries great authority, in fact, ultimate authority in what it says. And so as I'm reading through my Bible there in Genesis, it says these days have to be 24-hour days. And so lacking any more knowledge in that, I said, all right, if that's what scripture demands, that's where I live. But at the same time, I'm taking my physics classes. I've done enough reading to know that science is indicating the universe and the earth is much older than that. So I was just kind of wrestling with that idea. And ultimately what I found, I said, all right, what does the science have to say? I investigated that some, and that seemed pretty solid. But I also then asked the question, okay, what does Christianity say about this? And what I found was that throughout history, Christians have been either ambiguous or divided on this issue. That there is, if you take Christians who hold scripture in high regard and then ask them to question what is the proper way to interpret those days in Genesis, what you're going to find is people say, well, given that scripture is the supreme authority, it could be those are 24-hour days. Or it might be that those are much longer periods of time, kind of a day age type view. Or it may be that those days are an analogy to our work week. So they're like our days and unlike our days. Or it could be they're just a theological structure not meant to give chronology, but meant to teach theological things about who God is. And what I recognized is that Christians have thought a lot about this, and the only way that's a conflict is if you say scripture demands these are 24-hour days. There are many Bible-believing Christians who know how to study Greek, know how to study Hebrew, do good hermeneutics, hold scripture in high regard, and many of them say, no, this is not the proper way to look at that. And honestly, when you look, again, you just look through history, and there are many Christians who, by their testimony and by their witness, would say, yes, there are men and women of God who want to serve and follow him, who come down with the position that those are much longer periods of time. So it seems like it's a conflict that has to be there, but it's only a conflict if you mandate this particular reading of scripture that all of Christianity doesn't agree on.
Yeah.
And that has provided great freedom for me in approaching scripture.
That's amazing. And I know that was a huge question to throw at you right at the end there when we're getting out of time here. But Jeff, thanks so much for answering that and for being with us today. Great to have you on.
Thank you. I enjoyed the opportunity to have a conversation with you.
Amazing. Dr. Jeff Zweerink is an astrophysicist and a senior research scholar with reasons to believe. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.